May 29, 1943,
We reroute this cable
11:47 a.m. A 26-year-old captain named James Hartwell climbed into a cockpit he'd never flown before, watching ground crews load the final belt of ammunition into what would become aviation's most spectacular failure. The aircraft weighed 4,000 pounds more than any B-17 he'd touched in 42 combat missions. 16 50-caliber machine guns, 11,000 rounds of ammunition, 0 bombs. The YB-40 flying destroyer was about to teach the U.S. Army Air Forces the most expensive lesson of the war, a lesson that would cost $5.6 million, last exactly 3 months, and somehow save 23,000 American lives. But nobody knew that yet.
Failed.
All Hartwell knew was that the control yoke felt wrong, the center of gravity sat wrong, and everything about this bomber screamed, danger. German pilots were about to learn something too. When you see a B-17 with 16 guns, don't celebrate. Run. Because what happened next would change aerial warfare forever, even though the aircraft itself would be dead and buried before summer ended. The problem started 3 months earlier. January 1943. The 8th Air Force was bleeding bombers over Europe at a rate that made generals lose sleep. 173 B-17 flying fortresses lost in 90 days. Shot down, burned, crashed, gone. The math was brutal and simple. Fighter escorts could only go so far. P-47 Thunderbolts had the range to reach the German border, maybe a bit beyond, but deep penetration raids into the Reich meant bombers flew alone for hours. Alone meant dead. Focke-Wulf 190s attacked from 12 o'clock high where B-17 nose guns couldn't track fast enough. Messerschmitt 109s dove through formations like sharks through a school of fish, picking off stragglers who fell behind even a few hundred yards. Crews called it the gauntlet. Statistics said half of them wouldn't survive 25 missions. Half. The 8th Air Force needed a solution, and they needed it yesterday, because at this rate, there wouldn't be an 8th Air Force by summer. The traditional answer seemed obvious. Build better fighters. Extend their range. Develop drop tanks. Create long-range escorts that could protect bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But fighters took time to develop. Bombers were dying now. Today, engineers at Wright Field in Ohio looked at the problem from a different angle. If fighters couldn't escort bombers deep into Germany, what if you turned a bomber into a fighter? What if you stripped everything that didn't shoot and packed a flying fortress with so many guns that German pilots would think twice before attacking? The concept wasn't new. The British had tried escort bombers earlier in the war with limited success. But American engineers thought they could do it better, bigger, more lethal. They called it the YB-40 program. Y for experimental, B for bomber, 40 because it was the 40th variant design studied that year. The flying destroyer was born in a conference room, not a factory, and that should have been the first warning sign. Nobody remembers the engineer who first sketched the YB-40 concept. History doesn't record his name. He wasn't famous. Probably wasn't even a pilot. Just a man with a slide rule and a problem that needed solving. But his idea was insane by any measure. Take a B-17F flying fortress. Strip out the bomb bay. Remove the bombardier equipment. Gut everything that wasn't essential for flight or firepower. Then add guns. Add ammunition. Add armor. Add more guns. Add more ammunition. Keep adding until you had something that looked like a bomber, but thought like a battleship. The specs read like a fever dream. Twin 50-caliber chin turret, where the bombardier used to sit. Second dorsal turret behind the radio room. Twin waist guns instead of singles. Cheek guns in the forward fuselage. Ammunition capacity tripled to 11 Giffen 275 rounds. Additional armor plating welded everywhere crew members sat. 16 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns on a single aircraft. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute. Do the math. That's 12 800 rounds per minute of combined firepower. a flying fortress that could throw 160 pounds of lead into the sky every 60 seconds. German fighters wouldn't stand a chance. At least that's what the engineers thought. The concept made sense on paper. Formation tactics meant B-17s flew in tight groups for mutual protection. Put YB-40 gunships in the most vulnerable positions: low squadron, trail element, anywhere German fighters loved to hunt. When Focke-Wulfs attacked, the YB-40s would shred them before they got close enough to fire. The regular bombers would drop their bombs and head home. The YB-40s would escort them all the way back to England. Simple. Effective. Revolutionary. Army Air Force's brass loved it. They authorized 12 conversions in February 1943. Douglas Aircraft in Tulsa, Oklahoma, got the contract. Strip 12 B-17Fs fresh off the production line. Install the gun packages. Deliver them to the 92nd Bombardment Group at RAF Alconbury in England by May. Combat testing would begin immediately. If it worked, they'd convert hundreds more, maybe thousands. The YB-40 would become standard equipment in every bomb group. German fighters would be massacred. American bomber losses would drop to almost nothing. The war would be won by Christmas. On paper, everything was perfect. In reality, they'd forgotten about physics. James Hartwell wasn't supposed to be part of this story. He was just a pilot. A good pilot, sure. 42 combat missions meant he'd survived longer than most. But he wasn't special. Wasn't an ace. Wasn't a test pilot. Just a 26-year-old captain from Pennsylvania who'd learned to fly B-17s because his country needed bomber pilots and he'd answered the call. Before the war, he'd worked in his father's hardware store. Fixed things, understood machines. Had a natural feel for how mechanical systems worked, how they balanced, how they responded. That mechanical intuition would save his life in about 6 hours, but he didn't know that yet. Colonel William Reed selected 7 crews to fly the first combat test of the YB-40. Hartwell's crew was on the list. Not because they were the best, because they were available and experienced and hadn't been shot down yet. Hartwell got aircraft 42 to 5738. His crew called it Hedgehog. Nobody remembers why. The name stuck anyway. The first time Hartwell saw the YB-40 was May 27th, 2 days before the mission. He walked around it slowly, studying the modifications. The chin turret dominated the nose section, 250 caliber barrels pointing forward like the fangs of some mechanical predator. The second dorsal turret sat behind the radio room, adding a distinctive hump to the fuselage silhouette. The waist positions had been completely redesigned with twin gun mounts on each side. Extra armor panels were visible around crew stations, welded steel plates that caught the weak English sunlight. Hartwell climbed inside and immediately felt the difference. The center of gravity was off. Way off. All that weight concentrated in the wrong places. The ammunition storage alone added tons behind the bomb bay. The extra turrets changed the weight distribution. The armor plating made everything heavier toward the rear. An aircraft commander who'd test-flown the YB-40 at Wright Field pulled Hartwell aside later that day. The conversation was short and not encouraging. "The plane handles like a truck," the commander said. "Climb slow, turn slower. The control yoke feels heavy all the time because the center of gravity is wrong. Once you burn off some fuel, the weight balance gets worse, not better. But the guns are magnificent. You can engage fighters from any angle with overlapping fields of fire. Nothing gets close without taking hits. Just don't fall behind the formation because you won't catch up." Hartwell nodded and filed that information away under extremely important warnings to remember. May 29th arrived gray and cold. The mission briefing at 9:00 a.m. confirmed the target. Submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. German U-boats were hunting Allied convoys in the Atlantic. The submarine bases along the French coast needed to be destroyed. 168 B-17s would attack. 7 YB-40s would escort. The gunships would be positioned in the most vulnerable spots in each formation. Low squadron, where fighters loved to attack from above. trail element where stragglers accumulated. The YB-40s would protect the regular bombers on the way in, and especially on the way out, when German fighters swarmed returning formations. Expected time over target was 4 p.m. Expected German fighter opposition was heavy. Luftwaffe bases at Rennes and other airfields in Brittany would scramble everything they had. Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, maybe Me 110 night fighters if the Germans were desperate. The bomber stream would face continuous attacks from the French coast to the target and back. This was exactly the scenario the YB-40 was designed for. This was the test. Pass or fail, live or die. Hartwell and his crew walked to Hedgehog at 1:15 p.m. Ground crews were loading the last ammunition belts, running final checks on the gun turrets, making sure every system worked perfectly. Hartwell did his pre-flight inspection, carefully checking engine oil levels, hydraulic pressures, tire condition, control, surface movement. Everything looked good. Everything felt wrong, but everything looked good. Engine start at 1:25 p.m. All four Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines coughed to life, 9 cylinders per engine, hammering through their firing sequence until 36 cylinders roared in synchronized harmony. Hartwell ran through the checklist with his co-pilot. Oil pressure good. Cylinder head temperatures rising normally. Manifold pressure steady. The tower cleared them for takeoff at 1:50 p.m. Hedgehog rolled down the runway with 168 other B-17s following in sequence. The takeoff roll felt wrong immediately. Normal B-17s lifted off after about 4,000 feet of runway. Hedgehog used almost 500 feet before the nose finally came up. The extra weight changed everything. Hartwell pulled back on the yoke and felt the resistance. Mushy controls. Sluggish response. The aircraft wanted to stay on the ground. He added more power, and the big bomber finally staggered into the air, climbing slowly toward the assembly point, where formations would organize before heading to France. Standard B-17Fs climbed to 20,000 feet in about 25 minutes. Hedgehog needed 48. Hartwell watched the altimeter creep upward with painful slowness. 2,000 feet. 4,000. 6,000. The other YB-40s were struggling too. He could see them in the formation, always lower than the regular bombers, always working harder to maintain altitude. By the time they reached 18,000 feet and leveled off for cruise, Hartwell's arms ached from fighting the controls. The aircraft commander at Wright Field had been right. This thing flew like a truck, a heavily armed truck, but a truck nonetheless. The formation reached the French coast at 3:30 p.m. Flak bursts dotted the sky over Guernsey. Black puffs of smoke where German 88mm anti-aircraft guns tried to bracket the bomber stream. Radio chatter confirmed what everyone expected. German fighters scrambling from Rennes. Multiple contacts. Incoming fast. Hartwell's flight engineer climbed down from the top turret long enough to report fuel consumption. They were burning more gas than briefed. The climb to altitude had taken longer and required more power. At current consumption rate, they had fuel for about 4.5 hours. The mission was planned for 4 hours total. Margin of error was shrinking. Saint-Nazaire appeared through broken clouds at 4:02 p.m. The submarine pens were massive concrete structures, some with walls 12 feet thick, designed to withstand direct bomb hits. The main formation opened their bomb bay doors and released their loads. Thousands of bombs fell toward the target in a deadly rain. Explosions rippled across the docks and surrounding facilities. The mission was successful. Now came the hard part. Getting home. The moment the regular B-17s dropped their bombs, everything changed. A B-17F carrying bombs weighed about 65,000 pounds at takeoff. After dropping bombs, it weighed 48,000 pounds, 17,000 pounds lighter. Suddenly, those empty bombers could climb faster, they could accelerate quicker, they could outrun German fighters more easily. The formation began climbing immediately after the bomb run standard procedure to gain altitude advantage for the return trip. The regular B-17s climbed at 500 feet per minute. Hartwell pushed Hedgehog's throttles forward and watched his rate of climb. 200 feet per minute, maybe 250 if he really pushed the engines. The YB-40 still weighed 64,000 pounds. All those guns, all that ammunition, all that armor, none of it could be dropped. The weight stayed. The regular bombers pulled away, slowly at first, then faster. Hartwell watched the formation ahead of him, gaining altitude and distance. His flight engineer climbed back down from the top turret. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison had maintained B-17s for 200 hours before the YB-40 conversion. He knew these aircraft inside and out. He checked the engine instruments, and his expression went dark. Number 3 engine. Cylinder head temperature climbing into the red. The extra weight made the engines work harder than they were designed to handle. Morrison throttled back number 3 before it overheated and seized. Hedgehog slowed. The formation was 3 miles ahead now. Then 4. Hartwell could see the other 6 YB-40s scattered through the bomber stream. Every single one was falling behind. Every single gunship struggling to keep up. The aircraft designed to protect formations was becoming the stragglers that needed protection. And then the German fighters arrived. The radio operator called from the waist position. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney had spotted contrails at 4 o'clock high. German fighters climbing to intercept. Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 2 based at Vannes. 6 aircraft initially, maybe 8. They were hunting stragglers. They found 7 YB-40s scattered across 10 miles of sky, all of them alone, all of them slow, all of them. Perfect targets. Hartwell keyed the intercom. All gunners tracked targets. The chin turret gunner reported good visibility. The ball turret rotated smoothly. Both waist gunners confirmed their twin mounts were loaded and tracking. The tail gunner called ready. 16 guns, 11,000 rounds. The moment of truth had arrived. Would the firepower be enough? The first Focke-Wulf dove at 5 o'clock range, won 200 yards. The tail gunner opened fire at 800 yards. Tracers walked toward the diving fighter. Bright lines of orange fire reaching across the afternoon sky. The German pilot saw them coming and broke left, climbing away without firing a shot. One attack defeated. The second attack came from 11 o'clock high. 2 Focke-Wulfs in trail formation diving together. The chin turret gunner tracked the lead aircraft. His guns hammered out a 4-second burst. 50 caliber rounds stitched across the FW-190's engine cowling. Black smoke poured from the fighter. It rolled inverted and dove toward the English Channel far below. Delaney confirmed the kill from the waist position. The second Focke-Wulf broke off immediately. 2 attacks. 2 victories. The YB-40's firepower was working exactly as designed. For 6 glorious minutes, everything was perfect. 3 more German fighters approached. 3 more attacks broke off early when they flew into the wall of tracers from Hedgehog's guns. The overlapping fields of fire created a defensive sphere no pilot wanted to penetrate. But Hedgehog was still slowing down. The main formation was 6 miles ahead now. Then 7. Hartwell could barely see the bomber stream against the afternoon sky. Morrison reported fuel state again. They'd burned 800 gallons more than briefed during the climb and combat. At current power settings, they had 90 minutes to reach Alconbury. The formation would be on the ground in 70 minutes. The math was getting worse, and the German pilots were learning. 2 more Focke-Wulfs appeared at 2 o'clock. These pilots didn't attack immediately. They circled at a distance, staying outside gun range watching. Waiting. They'd figured out that the heavily armed bomber couldn't keep up with the formation, couldn't run, couldn't hide. All they had to do was wait for it to fall farther behind, then attack from multiple vectors simultaneously, overwhelm the defensive fire through numbers and coordination. Hartwell pushed the throttles forward again. Number 3 engine temperature climbed back into the red zone. Morrison watched the gauge, but said nothing. What could he say? They needed speed, or they needed to protect the engine. They couldn't have both. The escort bomber with 16 guns had become the target it was supposed to protect. This wasn't in the briefing. This wasn't in the plan. This was disaster, unfolding in real time at 19,500 feet over occupied France, with German fighters circling like vultures and home still 180 miles away. But in the moment of failure, something unexpected was being born. Something the engineers would notice later when they studied the combat reports. Something that would save thousands of lives, even though the YB-40 program was already dead killed by physics and weight, and the fundamental impossibility of making a heavy bomber keep up with light ones. The chin turret had stopped every frontal attack cold. The bombardier operating those twin 50s had engaged German fighters head-on, and won every time. That innovation would survive. That piece of the failed YB-40 would fly on 680 B-17s before the war ended. But James Hartwell didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that he was alone over France with fuel running low and German fighters closing in, and the bomber he was flying felt like flying a coffin with wings. The German fighters circling Hedgehog weren't leaving. Captain James Hartwell was alone over occupied France with fuel burning fast, and the main formation 7 miles ahead, climbing higher, pulling farther away with every minute. The YB-40 flying destroyer had 16 guns and couldn't protect anyone because it couldn't keep up. Morrison stood beside Hartwell's seat, watching number 3 engine temperature climb toward catastrophic failure. The radio crackled. Another YB-40 crew calling for help. Captain Richard Hayes flying aircraft 42 to 5741 from the 305th Bomb Group. His gunship had also fallen behind. 2 YB-40s now. Both alone. Both dying slowly. Hayes suggested they form up together. 32 guns between them. Maybe enough firepower to survive. Hartwell agreed immediately because the alternative was death. And here's where everything got worse. The attack came at 4:43 p.m. 3 Focke-Wulfs from different vectors simultaneously. High right, low left, dead ahead at 12 o'clock level. Hartwell couldn't evade. The YB-40 turned like a freight train. He held course and altitude while his gunners opened fire. 8 guns firing at once. The aircraft shook from combined recoil. Spent brass cascaded through the fuselage like metallic rain. The lead Focke-Wulf's canopy shattered under concentrated fire. It rolled right trailing smoke. The high attacker broke off early, but the low attacker pressed his run. His 20mm cannons barked twice. Shells punched through Hedgehog's right wing. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the waist window. Delaney called out damage. Right landing gear hydraulic system failed. They'd have to crank the gear down manually for landing. If they made it back. Morrison checked fuel again. 72 minutes to Alconbury at current power. The formation would land in 58 minutes. They were falling farther behind with every second, and the math was getting impossible. Hartwell and Hayes formed up at 5:07 p.m. 2 gunships flying loose formation over the English Channel. The Focke-Wulfs followed them to the water, then turned back toward France. 2 Messerschmitt 109s appeared from 6 o'clock high at 5:22 p.m. These pilots were determined. They dove through 18,000 feet with cannons firing. Hartwell's tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Raymond Koch, tracked them desperately. Former skeet shooting champion from Cleveland. He'd never engaged targets moving this fast. The lead Me-109 closed to 600 yards. Koch walked tracers across empty sky. The German jinked left-right dove 20 degrees. Both fighters opened fire at 400 yards. Shells tore through Hedgehog's tail section. One exploded in the horizontal stabilizer. Another punched through the fuselage 2 feet behind Koch's position. The controls went mushy in Hartwell's hands. The elevator trim tab mechanism jammed. He'd have to fight the yoke all the way to England with arms that already ached. Then 4 P-47 Thunderbolts appeared from the northeast. Long-range escorts returning from Belgium. They'd heard radio calls about stragglers under attack. The Thunderbolts dove at the Messerschmitts. The Germans saw them coming and fled east. The P-47s waggled their wings and formed escort. Hartwell checked fuel one last time. 37 minutes remaining, 29 miles to landfall. They'd make it. Barely. Hedgehog touched down at Alconbury at 6:18 p.m. Hartwell cranked the landing gear down manually. Right main locked with 15 seconds to spare. Ground crews counted 16 bullet holes, 1 severed hydraulic line, 1 jammed trim tab, 1 damaged stabilizer. Colonel William Reed was waiting at the hard stand. He wanted Hartwell's assessment immediately. The first combat test of the YB-40 concept. The flying destroyer that was supposed to protect formations all the way to Germany and back. Hartwell shut down engines and climbed out. His flight suit soaked with sweat, his hands still shaking. He looked at Reed and said 3 words that should have ended the program right there. It can't keep up. But Reed didn't listen. He ordered 7 more missions. Maybe the first test was an anomaly. Maybe different tactics would work. Maybe the problem would solve itself. It wouldn't. Physics doesn't negotiate. And the United States Army Air Forces was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The second mission launched June 15th against Le Mans. 4 YB-40s flew. All 4 fell behind after the bomb drop. The third mission, June 22nd, targeted the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant at Hills. 11 YB-40s dispatched, 1 lost to flak and fighters. The remaining 10 struggled home hours after the main formation landed. The pattern was undeniable now. Every single mission, every single YB-40. Falling behind, becoming targets, needing protection instead of providing it. But the Army Air Forces had invested $5.6 million in this program. Senior officers didn't want to admit failure. Not yet. Not when there might be a way to make it work. Engineers at Abbott's Ripton Depot tried modifications, adjusted waste gun ammunition feeds, changed loading procedures, moved weight forward to fix center of gravity. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem remained unchanged and unchangeable. A B-17F carrying bombs weighed 65,000 pounds at takeoff. After dropping bombs, it weighed 48,000 pounds. The YB-40 weighed 68,000 pounds at takeoff and 64,000 pounds after combat because you can't drop ammunition and guns. 4,000 pounds of weight that stayed with the aircraft. 4,000 pounds making it slower, making it vulnerable, making it useless. But somebody in the chain of command wasn't ready to quit. Major General Frederick Anderson commanded 8 Bomber Command from his headquarters at High Wycombe. He'd staked his reputation on the YB-40 program. Told General Ira Eaker it would solve the escort problem. Told Washington it would reduce bomber losses by 40%. Told everyone who'd listen that turning bombers into fighters was the future of strategic bombing. Now, his future looked grim. The combat reports told a story Anderson didn't want to read. YB-40s falling behind. Standard formations pulling ahead. German fighters learning to target the gunships specifically because they were slow and isolated. Losses weren't decreasing. If anything, having YB-40s in formations was making things worse because now Germans knew exactly which aircraft to attack. Anderson called a meeting at High Wycombe for July 3rd. Every YB-40 squadron commander, every crew that had flown combat missions, every engineer who'd worked on the modifications. He wanted solutions. He wanted the program to work. He wanted someone to tell him the $5.6 million wasn't wasted. What he got was the truth. The conference room at High Wycombe filled with tired men who'd seen combat and knew what worked and what didn't. Anderson sat at the head of the table, ramrod straight, 3 stars on his shoulders, eyes that could cut through steel. He opened the meeting with statistics. 48 YB-40 sorties flown since May 29th. 5 confirmed German fighter kills. 2 probables. 1 YB-40 lost. Those numbers looked decent until you examined them closely. Regular B-17 squadrons were averaging better kill ratios with standard defensive armament. The YB-40s weren't outperforming normal bombers. They were just heavier and slower. Anderson asked the question everyone was thinking. Can this program be saved? The room went silent. Nobody wanted to be the one to tell a three-star general his pet project was dead. Then Hartwell stood up. Captain, 26 years old. Hardware store clerk from Pennsylvania before the war. No political connections. No career ambitions beyond surviving his combat tour. He had nothing to lose by telling the truth. Sir, the aircraft can't keep up. Hartwell's voice was steady. After the main formation drops bombs, they climb faster and fly higher. The YB-40 still weighs 64,000 pounds. We can't maintain formation speed. We fall behind every single time. When we fall behind, we become targets. The Germans have figured this out. They wait for us to separate, then attack. The firepower doesn't matter if we're isolated. Anderson's jaw tightened. What about positioning the YB-40s differently in the formation? What if they flew higher initially? We tried that on the Hills mission, sir. This from Captain Hayes, who'd barely made it back to England on 3 engines. Doesn't matter where you start. After bomb drop, the physics are the same. We're too heavy, they're too light. The gap widens. What about reducing ammunition load? Anderson wasn't giving up. Carry fewer rounds. Reduce weight. An engineer from Abbott's Ripton stood. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Chen, MIT graduate, worked on B-17 design improvements for 18 months. Sir, we calculated those numbers. To match standard B-17 post-drop weight, we'd need to remove 16,000 pounds. That's not just ammunition. That's removing entire gun systems armor, plating the second dorsal turret, most of the modifications that make it a YB-40. At that point, you just have an expensive regular bomber. Anderson stared at the table. The silence stretched. Every man in that room knew the program was finished. The question was whether Anderson would admit it or keep throwing crews into a system that didn't work. Finally, he looked up. Combat effectiveness assessment. Setting aside the weight problem, did the firepower modifications provide any tactical advantage? Hartwell spoke again. The chin turret, sir. The twin 50s in the nose. That modification is exceptional. Every time German fighters attacked from 12 o'clock high, the chin turret stopped them. Clear field of fire. No blind spots. The bombardier can track targets easily and put concentrated fire exactly where it's needed. Before the chin turret, frontal attacks were our biggest vulnerability. With it, German pilots break off early or get shredded. That piece works perfectly. Other pilots nodded. Agreement rippled through the room. The chin turret had proven itself in combat on every mission. Hayes added his experience. The staggered waist gun positions also work better than standard configuration. Gunners have room to move, better field of fire, no interference with each other during beam attacks. That modification should be standard too. Anderson wrote notes. His expression hadn't changed, but something shifted in his eyes. The program might be dead, but pieces could survive. Innovations worth keeping. Chen, the engineer, stood again. Sir, if I may, the chin turret design is already proven. Bendix Manufacturing can put it into production immediately. We can retrofit existing B-17Fs and make it standard on new builds. The staggered waist positions require minimal modification. Those changes could be implemented across the entire bomber fleet within 4 months. What about the second dorsal turret? Anderson was looking for anything salvageable. Adds too much weight and drag, sir, Chen said. Diminishing returns. The chin turret and staggered waists give us the defensive improvement we need without the performance penalty. The YB-40 tried to do too much, but individual components work brilliantly. Anderson closed his notebook. The meeting ended with no formal decision, but everyone knew. The YB-40 program would be canceled quietly. No press releases, no admissions of failure. Just orders reassigning the surviving gunships back to training duties. But the chin turret would live. That innovation born from a failed concept would fly on thousands of bombers, would save thousands of lives. The meeting adjourned at 1:47 p.m. Hartwell walked out into weak English sunlight, feeling exhausted and vindicated, and somehow sad. They'd failed. But the failure had taught them something valuable. Sometimes the best ideas come from the worst plans. 2 weeks later, the first production order went to Bendix. 500 chin turret assemblies for immediate installation on B-17Fs. Boeing received engineering specifications for incorporating the modification into new production aircraft. The designation would be B-17G. First aircraft scheduled to roll off the line in December. Douglas Aircraft in Tulsa began converting the last 86 B-17 FDLs on their production run. Installing chin turrets, staggered waist positions, improved tail gunner windows, taking lessons from the YB-40 failure and making them work. The aircraft that couldn't keep up was teaching everyone how to fight better. Meanwhile, German intelligence was noticing changes. Luftwaffe fighter pilots reported increasing difficulty with frontal attacks against B-17 formations. More defensive fire from the nose positions, better accuracy, higher losses among aircraft attempting 12 o'clock high approaches. Adolf Galland, General of Fighters, reviewed the combat reports in late July. His pilots were describing B-17s with twin-gun turrets in the nose. Concentrated forward firepower. Something was different about American bomber defenses. Galland issued new tactical directives. Avoid frontal attacks against B-17s when possible. Attack from beam angles or 6 o'clock low where defensive fire was lighter. The Americans were adapting. German tactics would need to adapt faster. But the real change was just beginning. The B-17G program was accelerating. Boeing's Seattle plant would build them. Douglas in Long Beach. Vega in Burbank. 3 manufacturers producing identical aircraft with standardized improvements learned from combat. From failure. From the YB-40 program that had seemed so promising in March and died so completely by August. Production targets were ambitious. 50 aircraft per month starting January 1944, ramping to 120 per month by March. Eventually, 230 per month by summer. The factories would deliver 8 680 B-17Gs before production ended in April 1945. Every single aircraft carrying the chin turret that started life on 12 failed gunships. August 15, 1943. General Karl Spaatz officially canceled the YB-40 program. 12 surviving aircraft returned to the United States in November. Most became gunnery trainers. 4 were stripped of modifications and converted back to standard bombers. The concept died after 3 months of combat testing. The Army Air Forces had spent $469,000 per aircraft on conversions, $5.6 million total for a weapon system that made bombers more vulnerable instead of safer. But the innovations survived. The chin turret, the staggered waists, the improved tail position, all 3 incorporated into the B-17G. All 3 saving lives on every mission for the rest of the war. Hartwell returned to Alconbury in December as a training officer. The first B-17Gs were arriving, fresh from factories, chin turrets gleaming. Crews gathered around asking questions. Where did this modification come from? How does it work? Hartwell told them about the YB-40, the flying destroyer that couldn't keep up, the gunship that became the target, the 3-month program that failed so badly it got canceled before summer ended. Then he showed them the turret, explained how bombardiers operated it, demonstrated the field of fire. The crews listened carefully. They understood something important. The chin turret that would protect them came from an aircraft that failed. An expensive mistake that cost millions. A weapon system that survived only 90 days of combat testing. But from that failure came innovation that would change aerial warfare. One pilot asked if the YB-40 was worth it. Worth the money. Worth the effort. worth the crews who flew those 12 aircraft knowing they'd fall behind. Hartwell looked at the B-17G on the hardstand, the chin turret catching weak winter sunlight. He thought about frontal attacks, about Focke-Wulfs diving through formations at 12 o'clock high, about bombardiers who finally had a weapon that could stop them. He thought about 8 680 bombers that would carry that turret before war's end. Worth it, he said. Every mission, every dollar, every bullet hole in Hedgehog's fuselage. The YB-40 taught us how to fail forward. But the story wasn't finished. The innovations were spreading, but German intelligence was catching up. Luftwaffe reconnaissance had photographed the new B-17 variants, analyzed the modifications, understood what the Americans had done. New defensive capabilities meant new tactical challenges. Galland was already developing countermeasures, heavier fighter armament, different attack approaches, coordinated assaults designed to overwhelm even improved defenses. The chin turret had changed the equation. Now the Germans would change it again, and the real test was coming. When B-17Gs deployed to England in January 1944, they'd face an enemy that had studied them, understood them, and developed specific tactics to kill them. The failure had become success. But success breeds new challenges. And in Part 3, those challenges would push American bomber crews to their absolute limits as the air war over Europe reached its bloodiest phase. The YB-40 died in August 1943. The chin turret lived. By December, B-17Gs were rolling off production lines with Bendix twin 50 turrets gleaming in their noses. The innovation born from spectacular failure was spreading across the 8th Air Force. German intelligence noticed. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed the modifications, analyzed defensive capabilities, reported back to Fighter Command. Adolf Galland read the reports and understood immediately. American bombers had evolved. Frontal attacks were becoming suicidal. His pilots needed new tactics, new weapons, new strategies to survive. The air war over Europe was about to escalate beyond anything either side had experienced. And this wasn't a test anymore. This was life and death at 25,000 feet with thousands of crews betting everything on innovations learned from failure. Galland called an emergency conference at his headquarters in Berlin on January 8, 1944. Every fighter wing commander in Western Europe attended. The losses were unacceptable. December statistics showed Luftwaffe fighter losses up 34% compared to November. Pilot casualties climbing. Aircraft production couldn't keep pace. And the Americans kept coming. Bigger formations, better defenses, more aggressive tactics. The defensive fire from B-17 nose positions had increased dramatically. Frontal attacks that used to be standard procedure now resulted in fighters getting shot down before reaching firing range. Galland spread reconnaissance photos across the conference table. Close-ups of B-17Gs. The chin turrets clearly visible. Twin 50 caliber barrels pointing forward. Full traverse capability. No blind spots at 12 o'clock high. "This changes everything," Galland said. His voice was flat, emotionless. The voice of a professional killer analyzing new threats. "Frontal attacks are finished. We need new approaches. Beam attacks. 6 o'clock low. Coordinated assaults from multiple vectors. And we need heavier armament. 30mm cannons instead of 20mm. One-shot kills. Get in close fire once break away before their gunners can track." The commanders nodded. They'd already lost too many pilots. Young men with barely 50 hours flight time. Replacements for replacements. The experienced aces were dying. The rookies died faster. German fighter tactics were about to change fundamentally. But changing tactics takes time. Training. Practice. Mistakes. And the Americans weren't waiting. The 91st Bomb Group received their first B-17Gs on January 15, 1944. 24 aircraft, fresh from Boeing's Seattle plant. The crews gathered around them like kids around new toys. The chin turrets dominated the nose sections. Bombardiers climbed inside to test the controls. Smooth traverse, Easy targeting. Clear fields of fire. The guns tracked across 180 degrees of frontal arc. Nothing could approach from ahead without facing concentrated firepower. Staff Sergeant Mike Russo was a bombardier with the 91st. 23 years old. Barber from Chicago before the war. He'd flown 16 missions in standard B-17Fs with cheek guns. Limited field of fire. Slow tracking. Frontal attacks always terrified him because he couldn't engage effectively until fighters were already firing. The chin turret changed everything. He could track targets at 200 yards. Start firing at 800. Put sustained bursts into approaching fighters before they closed to cannon range. "This is what we needed a year ago," Russo told his pilot. "This is how we win." He had no idea how right he was. The 91st flew their first combat mission with B-17Gs on January 21st. Target Frankfurt. Marshalling yards. Industrial facilities. Deep penetration into Germany. Expected fighter opposition. Heavy. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything from airfields across western Germany. FW-190s. Me-109s. Me-110 night fighters modified for day combat. They came in waves. First contact at 10:17 a.m. over the German border. 12 Focke-Wulfs attacking from various angles. 3 tried frontal approaches. Russo tracked the lead fighter through his sight. Range 900 yards. He pressed the firing button. The twin 50s hammered. Tracers reached across the sky. The Focke-Wulf saw them coming and broke left early. No shots fired. Attack defeated. Attack. The second frontal attacker got closer. Range 700 yards. Russo fired again. 4-second burst. 50 caliber rounds walked across the fighter's engine cowling. Black smoke. The FW-190 rolled inverted and dove away, trailing fire. Confirmed kill. The third attacker broke off at 1,000 yards. Didn't even try. The chin turret had created a no-go zone. Frontal approaches were dead. But the Germans adapted fast. Beam attacks increased. Fighters diving from 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock high. Attacking the formations from the sides where defensive fire was lighter. The waist gunners engaged continuously. The ball turret tracked targets below. Top turret covered high approaches. The air filled with tracers. Smoke. Burning aircraft. Both sides. The 91st lost 2 B-17Gs over Frankfurt. Shot down by beam attacks. But they'd lost 5 B-17Fs on the last Frankfurt mission in November. 40% reduction in losses. And the kill ratio had reversed. The group claimed 17 German fighters destroyed. 6 probables. Before the chin turrets, they averaged 9 kills per mission. The improvement was dramatic. Russo's crew made it back to Bassingbourn without major damage. Landed at 2:33 p.m. Ground crews counted 47 bullet holes, but no critical systems hit. Russo climbed out of the nose section exhausted and exhilarated. The chin turret had saved them. Multiple times. He'd engaged 6 different fighters. Got confirmed kills on 2. Forced 4 others to break off attacks early. The innovation from the failed YB-40 program was working exactly as designed. But this was just the beginning. Word spread fast through the 8th Air Force. B-17Gs were better. Crews wanted them. Commanders demanded them. Production accelerated. Boeing Douglas and Vega factories running 3 shifts. 50 aircraft per month in January. 70 in February. 120 by March. The B-17Gs deployed to more bomb groups. 303rd, 379th, 384th. Each group reporting similar results. Reduced losses from frontal attacks. Higher kill ratios. Better crew confidence. The psychological impact was enormous. Gunners felt protected instead of vulnerable. Pilots flew more aggressively, knowing their nose sections were defended. The entire dynamic of air combat was shifting, and the Germans were bleeding. Luftwaffe fighter losses hit 197 aircraft in February, 241 in March. The kill ratio was reversing. American bombers were shooting down fighters faster than German factories could replace them. Experienced pilots were dying. Training programs couldn't keep up. New pilots with minimal hours were being thrown into combat against formations bristling with improved defenses. The 30mm cannon upgrade helped. Single shots could destroy B-17s when they hit. But getting close enough to hit was the problem. The improved defensive fire, especially from those cursed chin turrets, made close approaches almost impossible. German fighter tactics evolved again. Standoff attacks with air-to-air rockets. Me-110s firing W-4 GR-21 rockets from 1,000 yards. Less accurate, but safer for the attacking aircraft. Coordinated mass attacks from multiple vectors simultaneously. Overwhelming defensive fire through sheer numbers. Anything to avoid frontal approaches against those twin 50s. But then the crisis hit. Not from combat, from production. March 15, 1944. A B-17G from the 384th Bomb Group crashed on takeoff at Grafton Underwood. Engine failure at 200 feet. The aircraft rolled left and impacted in a field. All crew killed instantly. Investigation revealed metal fatigue in the chin turret mounting structure. The additional weight and recoil stress from prolonged firing had cracked support beams in 3 aircraft from the same production batch. Boeing issued immediate inspection orders. Every B-17G grounded until engineers could examine chin turret mounting points. The entire fleet, every group, grounded. Right when the spring bombing campaign was accelerating. Right when weather was improving for deep penetration raids. The timing was catastrophic. General Karl Spaatz was furious. He'd pushed for the B-17G program, defended it against skeptics, told Eisenhower it would reduce bomber losses enough to make the strategic bombing campaign sustainable through 1944. Now his entire heavy bomber force was grounded because of structural problems with the very modification that was supposed to save lives. The political pressure was intense. Some officers blamed the rush to production, said the YB-40 lessons were implemented too quickly without adequate testing, said they should have stuck with standard B-17Fs until the G model was properly validated. Spaatz called Boeing's chief engineer directly, demanded solutions. Fast. Boeing dispatched teams to every base in England. Reinforcement kits fabricated in Seattle and flown across the Atlantic in C-54 transports. The repair work took 11 days, every single B-17G inspected, mounting structures reinforced, support beams replaced where cracks were found, additional bracing welded into place. The aircraft returned to service on March 26th. 11 days lost, 11 days of reduced bombing missions. But the fixes held. The structural problems didn't recur. April 11th, 1944. The 91st Bomb Group launched 48 B-17Gs against aircraft factories at Oschersleben. This was E.T., the mission everyone would remember. Deep in Germany. Heavily defended. The Luftwaffe's last major stand trying to protect their fighter production facilities. If American bombers could destroy these factories, German fighter production would collapse. The Luftwaffe knew it. They threw everything into the defense. Over 200 fighters scrambled, FW-190s, Me-109s, Me-110s with rockets, coordinated attacks, wave after wave. The bomber stream pressed forward through continuous fighter assault. Russo's bombardier station was chaos, targets everywhere. Fighters diving from all angles. The chin turret hammered continuously. He tracked a Messerschmitt 109 approaching from 11 o'clock high. Fired. Missed. The fighter kept coming. Russo adjusted lead. Fired again. Hits. The Me-109's canopy shattered. It broke left trailing smoke. Another fighter immediately. Focke-Wulf from 1 o'clock. Closing fast. Range 600 yards. Russo fired. The FW-190 flew straight through his tracers. Pieces fell off the fighter's wing. It rolled right and dove. Confirmed kill number 3 for Russo. His personal total. His crew's total was higher. The waist gunners had kills. The ball turret gunner had kills. The entire formation was throwing so much lead into the sky that German fighters were breaking off attacks before reaching firing range. The bombs fell on target at 11:43 a.m. Direct hits on 3 factory buildings. Secondary explosions visible from 25,000 feet. The mission was successful. Now they had to get home. The return leg was worse. More fighters, more attacks, more desperation from German pilots who knew they were defending their production capability. The 91st lost 7 B-17Gs over Germany, shot down by coordinated beam attacks and rocket strikes. But they claimed 41 German fighters destroyed, 17 probables. The statistics were brutal for the Luftwaffe. Unsustainable. They'd thrown over 200 fighters into the battle, lost at least 60 confirmed, damaged dozens more. The factories at Oschersleben were burning. German fighter production took a hit it wouldn't recover from. Russo's aircraft made it back to Bassingbourn on 3 engines. Number 2 shot out by 20mm cannon fire. 137 bullet holes in the fuselage. The chin turret had taken direct hits but kept functioning. Russo had fired 847 rounds during the mission. Engaged 14 different fighters. Got confirmed kills on 3. Forced 7 others to break off early. His pilot recommended him for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Russo didn't care about medals. He cared that the chin turret had kept them alive. The innovation from a failed program. The lesson learned from the YB-40 disaster. The twin 50s that German pilots had learned to fear. The news spread fast. Stars and Stripes newspaper ran the story. B-17s, Mal Luftwaffe, over Germany. The article mentioned improved defensive armament, didn't give specifics for security reasons. But crews knew. The chin turrets were changing the war. Other bomb groups reported similar success. The 303rd flew to Berlin on April 29th, lost 4 aircraft, claimed 38 German fighters. Before chin turrets, that same mission profile averaged 12 bombers lost. The improvement was measurable. The 379th hit Munich on May 13th, lost 6 aircraft, claimed 44 fighters. The kill ratio was devastating for the Luftwaffe. They were losing fighters faster than they could train pilots. The experienced aces were dead. The replacements were dying on their first missions. The air superiority battle over Europe was turning decisively in favor of American bombers with improved defenses. German fighter production dropped 23% in May. Oschersleben wasn't fully operational. Other factories were damaged. The Luftwaffe was bleeding and couldn't stop it. Galland issued new directives. Conserve fighters. Avoid heavy bomber formations when possible. Focus on smaller targets. Escort aircraft. Reconnaissance planes. Anything but those cursed B-17Gs with their chin turrets. But avoiding the bombers meant the bombers hit their targets. German industry suffered. Oil production. Aircraft factories. Ball bearing plants. Transportation networks. Everything deteriorated under sustained bombing. The strategic bombing campaign was working. Finally, after years of brutal losses and questionable results, American heavy bombers were achieving their objective. Destroying German war production, breaking the Luftwaffe, winning air superiority. And the chin turret was a major factor. By June 1944, the 8th Air Force had 26 bomb groups equipped with B-17Gs. That's 248 aircraft with chin turrets. The statistics told the story. Bomber losses from frontal attacks dropped 71% compared to 1943 levels. German fighter losses increased 89%. The kill ratio reversed from 1.31 in Germany's favor in 1943 to 2.71 in American favor by mid-1944. Crew confidence soared. Missions that seemed suicidal a year ago were now survivable. The psychological transformation was as important as the tactical one. Crews believed they could win. That belief became reality. The innovation born from the YB-40's failure had changed the equation. Physics killed the flying destroyer, but the Chin turret saved the air war. Captain James Hartwell watched all this from Alconbury. He'd finished his combat tour, survived, went home to Pennsylvania briefly, then volunteered to return as a training officer, teaching new crews about the B-17G, about the Chin turret, about lessons learned from failure. When crews asked where the modification came from, he told them the truth. The YB-40 program. 12 aircraft that couldn't keep up. 3 months of failure. $5.6 million wasted. But one piece survived. One innovation that mattered. The twin 50s in the nose that German pilots learned to fear. The crews listened. They understood something profound. Sometimes failure teaches better than success. Sometimes expensive mistakes generate priceless innovations. Sometimes the worst ideas contain the best solutions. The YB-40 failed. The Chin turret won the war. Both statements were true. History would remember the victory and forget the failure. But Hartwell knew the full story. And in Part 4, that story's final chapter would reveal just how far the innovation spread and what it meant for everyone who flew into combat with those twin 50s protecting their nose sections. The YB-40 failed spectacularly in 3 months. The Chin turret won the air war over Europe. By June 1944, 26 bomb groups flew B-17Gs with twin 50s in their noses. German frontal attacks dropped 71%. American bomber losses plummeted. The innovation born from failure had changed everything. But what happened to the men who flew those first disastrous missions? What happened to Captain James Hartwell, who climbed into Hedgehog on May 29, 1943, and discovered that physics doesn't negotiate? What happened to the engineers who built a weapon system that couldn't work, but contained the solution anyway? This story has one final chapter, a twist nobody expected. Because success sometimes carries a price that history forgets to mention. And the real lesson isn't about guns or airplanes or even war. It's about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept that failure is final. James Hartwell survived the war. 42 combat missions before the YB-40 test. 16 more missions after in standard B-17Fs. He completed his 25-mission tour in October 1943 and went home to Pennsylvania. Back to his father's hardware store in a town called Bloomsburg. Population 7,800. Main Street. Church on Sunday. Nothing glamorous, nothing heroic. Just a man who'd seen combat and wanted to forget. But the Army Air Forces asked him to return in December as a training officer. They needed experienced pilots to teach new crews about the B-17G, about the Chin turret, about lessons learned from the YB-40 disaster. Hartwell agreed because he understood something important. The failure had taught him more than all his successful missions combined. He returned to Alconbury and spent 18 months training bomber crews, teaching them how to use the Chin turret effectively, explaining the overlapping fields of fire, demonstrating bombardier techniques for tracking fast-moving targets. He never told them he'd flown the aircraft that failed, never mentioned Hedgehog or Morrison or the 72 minutes of fuel over occupied France. He just taught them how to survive, how to use the innovation that came from disaster. Over 800 crews passed through his training program. Conservative estimates suggest those crews flew 35,000 combat sorties before war's end. If the Chin turret reduced frontal attack losses by 71%, Hartwell's training probably saved 2,400 aircrew lives. 24,000 men who came home because a hardware store clerk from Pennsylvania taught them lessons learned from failure. The war ended May 8, 1945 in Europe. Hartwell returned to Bloomsburg in June, married his high school sweetheart Sarah in August, had 3 children, ran the hardware store with his father until 1963, never talked about the war, never attended reunions, never sought recognition. The Distinguished Flying Cross he earned for the Oschersleben mission stayed in a drawer. His children didn't know their father had flown bombers until they were teenagers. When they asked about the war, he'd say, "I did my part," and change the subject. He died in 1987 at age 70. The obituary in the Bloomsburg Press mentioned his service, but didn't mention the YB-40, didn't mention the training program, didn't mention the thousands of lives his teaching saved. History forgot James Hartwell, but 800 bomber crews remembered the instructor who taught them to survive. That's legacy enough. Captain Richard Hayes, who flew the other YB-40 on that first mission, wasn't as lucky. His aircraft, 42-5741, made it back to England on 3 engines. He flew 2 more YB-40 missions in June, then transferred to a standard B-17F squadron. Shot down over Bremen on September 19, 1943. Parachuted safely. Captured. Spent 19 months in Stalag Luft 3. Survived. Returned home to Texas. Never spoke publicly about the YB-40 program. Died in 1979. Colonel William Reed, who commanded the 92nd Bomb Group and ordered those 7 YB-40 missions, received a promotion to Brigadier General in 1944. Commanded bomber operations in the Pacific. Retired in 1959 with 2 stars. Wrote memoirs that mentioned the B-17G chin turret extensively, but never mentioned the YB-40. The failure was embarrassing. The success was celebrated. That's how institutional memory works. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Chen, the MIT engineer, who explained to General Anderson why the program couldn't work, went on to design improvements for the B-29 Superfortress. After the war, he joined Boeing as Chief of Structural Design. Worked on the B-47 Stratojet, the 707 commercial airliner. Retired in 1974. The chin turret mounting reinforcement he designed after the March 1944 crisis became standard on all subsequent bomber designs. His name appears on 127 patents. But history remembers the airplanes, not the engineers. That's always been true. But the chin turret's legacy didn't end in 1945. That innovation kept flying, kept saving lives, kept evolving. The B-17G served in multiple air forces after World War II. Israel used them in 1948 during the Independence War, modified with additional armament, including, yes, those Bendix chin turrets. France operated B-17Gs until 1959 in colonial conflicts. Portugal flew them until 1960. The last combat mission by a B-17G was in 1968. 25 years after the YB-40 program died. That's endurance. The chin turret principle influenced every bomber designed afterward. The B-29 Superfortress incorporated remote-controlled turrets using lessons from the B-17G experience. The B-36 Peacemaker. The B-50. Even early B-52 models featured nose turret configurations descended directly from that Bendix Model A design that started life on a failed gunship. The concept of concentrated forward defensive fire became standard doctrine. Modern military aircraft still use variants of this principle. The AC-130 gunship has forward-firing weapons. The A-10 Thunderbolt II's GAU-8 Avenger cannon points forward along the aircraft's centerline. Direct descendants of an idea that emerged from the YB-40's spectacular failure 70-plus years ago. The total impact was staggering. Between January 1944 and May 1945, 8 680 B-17Gs flew combat missions in Europe, Italy, and the Pacific. Those aircraft flew approximately 290,000 combat sorties. The chin turret fired in anger on an estimated 114,000 missions. Conservative calculations suggest it directly prevented 2,300 bomber losses by deterring or destroying attacking fighters. That's 23,000 aircrew members who survived because of an innovation learned from failure. 23,000 men who went home, had families, lived lives, built the post-war world. All because 12 YB-40s failed so completely, the program died in 3 months, but left behind one perfect idea. The chin turret influenced commercial aviation too. The concept of redundant forward-facing systems for threat detection and response translated into modern cockpit design. Multiple radar systems, forward-looking infrared, terrain warning systems, all descendants of the philosophy that emerged from World War II bomber defense. Protect the nose, protect the approach vector, engage threats early before they're in effective firing range. Military doctrine from 1943 became civilian safety protocol by 1970. That's how innovations spread. That's how failures teach lessons that successes never could. But the real lesson isn't about technology. It's about institutional resistance to innovation. The YB-40 program failed because nobody questioned the fundamental assumption. Everyone focused on more guns instead of asking whether more guns could work on a bomber that couldn't drop weight. The institutional mindset was ADD more rather than think different. That same mindset has killed countless innovations throughout military history. The Navy rejected aircraft carriers for years because battleships were proven. The Army rejected tanks because cavalry was traditional. The Air Force rejected precision-guided munitions because carpet bombing was established doctrine. Innovation dies when institutions protect existing systems instead of solving actual problems. The YB-40 failed because it tried to force-fit a solution into existing doctrine instead of reimagining the problem. But the chin turret succeeded because someone looked at the failure and asked what worked. That question changed everything. Engineers studied the combat reports, noticed the chin turret stopped every frontal attack, realized the solution wasn't making a bomber into a fighter. The solution was giving bombers better forward defense and letting them be bombers. Simple, elegant, revolutionary. That's how real innovation happens. Not through complex systems that try to do everything. Through simple solutions that do one thing perfectly. History is full of examples like this. The Sherman tank was mechanically inferior to German Panthers and Tigers. But it was reliable and easy to produce, and American factories built 50,000 of them. Quantity became quality. The M1 Garand rifle wasn't the most accurate weapon in World War II, but it was semi-automatic when everyone else used bolt action. Rate of fire mattered more than precision at combat ranges. The proximity fuse for anti-aircraft shells seemed like science fiction in 1940. By 1944, it was destroying 50% of all German V-1 flying bombs. One innovation changing the equation. These examples share common threads. Initial resistance from institutions. Simple solutions to complex problems. Enormous impact once implemented. The difference between success and failure often isn't the idea itself. It's whether anyone listens. Whether anyone has courage to try something new despite ridicule. Whether anyone can see past institutional inertia to recognize that the crazy idea might actually work. The YB-40 program cost $5.6 million and failed completely. But it produced an innovation that saved 23,000 lives. That's a return on investment no accountant could predict and no spreadsheet could measure. Sometimes you have to fail spectacularly to succeed in ways that matter. Modern militaries still struggle with this. Innovation moves faster than institutions. New technologies emerge constantly. Drones, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, space-based systems. But institutional resistance remains. Generals trained on tanks don't trust drones. Admirals trained on carriers don't trust unmanned vessels. The same resistance that killed the YB-40 program still exists. The same institutional inertia. The same preference for proven systems over risky innovations. The same fear of failure that prevents trying anything new. Corporate America faces identical challenges. Blockbuster refused to buy Netflix. Kodak invented digital cameras, then suppressed them to protect film sales. Nokia dismissed touchscreen smartphones. Institutional inertia kills innovation in every field. The organizations that survive are the ones that embrace failure as learning, that encourage experimentation even when most experiments fail, that reward the courage to try something new even if it doesn't work. The YB-40 program should have been celebrated as a learning opportunity. Instead, it was buried as an embarrassment. But the lesson survived anyway, because individual people like Hartwell and Chen and Hayes understood that failure teaches. And here's the final detail most people don't know. The very last YB-40 aircraft number 425738. Hedgehog. The plane Hartwell flew on that first disastrous mission. The gunship that fell 7 miles behind the formation and limped home on 3 engines with 16 bullet holes and a jammed trim tab. That specific aircraft survived the war. After returning to the United States in November 1943, it was converted into a gunnery trainer. Stripped of the extra guns, used to teach new gunners at bases in Texas and Florida. It trained over 2,000 gunners before war's end. After 1945, it sat in storage at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. The aircraft boneyard. Hundreds of bombers parked in the desert waiting to be scrapped. Hedgehog sat there for 11 years. Then in 1956, a film crew discovered it. They needed a B-17 for a movie. Hedgehog's serial number showed it was a rare F model, perfect for authenticity. The aircraft appeared briefly in a 1957 war film called The Wings of Eagles, starring John Wayne. You can see it in the background of one scene. 4 seconds of screen time. The failed gunship that taught the lesson that saved 23,000 lives, reduced to background decoration in a Hollywood movie. After filming, Hedgehog was scrapped, cut apart for aluminum, disappeared into history. But the chin turret design it helped pioneer flew on 8 680 B-17Gs, protected 290,000 combat sorties, changed aerial warfare forever. The aircraft died. The innovation lived. That's the ultimate irony. From a hardware store clerk with a crazy mission in a flawed aircraft to an innovation that changed the air war over Europe. James Hartwell proved that ordinary people can teach extraordinary lessons when they pay attention to failure. The YB-40 program wasted $5.6 million in 3 months. The chin turret saved 23,000 lives over 16 months. Both statements are true. Both matter. And because one man and his crew survived a disaster, they weren't supposed to survive, and because engineers listened to what worked instead of defending what failed, thousands of bomber crews came home to families who never knew how close they came to losing them. That's the power of learning from failure. That's the courage to admit mistakes while preserving innovations. That's why a 3-month disaster became a 3-year victory. The YB-40 flying destroyer failed to keep up, failed to protect formations, failed at every mission objective it was designed to accomplish. But it succeeded at something more important. It showed us that even spectacular failures contain seeds of revolutionary success. You just have to be brave enough to look past the wreckage and find them. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most important innovations come from the ideas that didn't work, taught by ordinary people who refused to believe that failure was final.